Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating source text that mounts a really detailed, pretty hard-hitting medical and historical critique against a very popular idea. Specifically, the belief that Islamic dietary laws are basically rooted in divine health foresight. We are going straight to the source today to unpack the author's exact case against this narrative. And trust me, it is a fascinating ride.
The author actually hooks us right from the start with this incredible childhood anecdote. Picture this. It's an Eid feast. You've got the traditional slaughter of a cow. The whole family is gathered around. And during the meal, the author's aunt politely declines the traditional fried cow brain, just casually asking, why is no one worried about prion disease? The central paradox here, which is kind of wild, is that almost everyone in that room was a physician. Yet, as the author points out, these medical doctors were completely ignoring the well-documented health risks of consecrated meat, treating the religious tradition as if it existed in a completely separate universe from their medical expertise. Which brings us to our first major section, science at the dinner table.
Here, the source really unpacks that fascinating tension. We have physicians who are perfectly capable of calculating really complex individual health risks, still adhering to a tradition that seemingly lacks any health warnings at all about beef. The author observes that when people defend these dietary laws, they almost always rely on this idea of divine foresight. The idea that God knew pork was dangerous way before science even had the microscopes to prove it. But the text highlights a massive discrepancy. The Quran addresses pork absolutely, across 4 different verses, without any qualification. There's no safe serving size, it's just banned. But for beef, there is absolutely zero harm reduction framework. The author notes that apologetics often fall back on moderation as the excuse for beef, but they totally fail to explain why that exact same standard of moderation isn't applied to other meats on the table. Moving right along, let's look at what the author calls the pork versus beef paradox.
The author highlights a really core contradiction here. On one side, you have the common apologetic argument for banning pork that it prevents trichinella and the pork tapeworm, which, yes, can migrate to the human brain. But on the flip side, the author points out that beef transmits its very own parasites, like the beef tapeworm, and carries the risk of deadly prions. So the crucial question the source poses is this. If this dietary rule was purely based on divine medical foresight, why is there such a massive blind spot when it comes to cattle?
Let's actually drill down into those specific documented health risks of beef that the text details. Because it's a lot. Saturated fatty acids in red meat are directly linked to ischemic heart disease, which the source notes is literally the single leading cause of death globally. Furthermore, the World Health Organization classifies red meat as a Group 2A carcinogen, and processed red meat lands in Group 1. That is the exact same category as tobacco smoke. Add to that the E. coli risks from undercooked ground beef and the literally 100% fatal variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease caused by prions. And get this, those prions actually survive standard cooking and sterilization. Despite this incredibly long list of diseases it contributes to, beef remains fully halal and is even mandated for religious sacrifice.
Now, when the medical argument kind of falters, the justification is often deflected to animal behavior. You've probably heard popular claims, like one cited in the text from Dr. Zakir Naik, stating that pigs are uniquely shameless or dirty. Well, the source directly refutes this. Pigs are absolutely no more promiscuous than goats, sheep, or cows. In fact, wild pigs are notably clean sleepers. They actively avoid soiling their sleeping areas, which is pretty stark when you compare them to cows, who frankly tend to excrete waste indiscriminately.
Okay, let's shift gears to Section 3, Alcohol, Honey, and Health.
The source takes a super interesting Socratic approach to this side-by-side comparison. So alcohol is absolutely prohibited, right? And apologists frequently point to liver damage, like cirrhosis, as the divine reasoning for that. But then we have honey. Honey is approximately 40% fructose and 30% glucose. The text points out that the overuse of fructose actually travels similar metabolic pathways and causes similar liver pathology as alcohol. Yet honey is explicitly endorsed in the Quran as a literal cure, with zero caveats about overuse. Meanwhile, alcohol, which the author notes actually has heavily documented medicinal, solvent, and antiseptic uses across centuries of pharmacology, is completely banned. The source basically argues that an omniscient medical framework probably shouldn't get those two things completely backwards.
And this inconsistency, it extends to zoonotic diseases too.
Those are diseases passed from animals to humans. Apologists frequently cite hepatitis E in pigs as proof of divine foresight, but the author counters that perfectly halal animals are just as capable of zoonotic transmission. Camels can transmit hepatitis C too, sheep can transmit Q fever and Rift Valley fever. In fact, the source notes that handling sheep is historically considered the sacred profession of prophets in the tradition, but there are absolutely zero warnings provided about Rift Valley fever. The author uses these blind spots to systematically dismantle that entire divine health foresight argument. So, if it's not about 7th century medical foresight, where did these rules actually come from? Let's get into Section 4, Historical Roots of Halal.
The source traces the evolution of the pork taboo long before Islam even existed. Babylonian wisdom literature labeled pigs as unclean as far back as the 8th century BCE. Ancient Egypt maintained its very own pork taboos, primarily for the priestly class. But perhaps most importantly, the text points to basic ecology. The Levantine highlands and the Arabian Peninsula simply didn't provide the shade and water that pigs need to survive. A mobile pastoral community literally couldn't raise them. Over centuries, the source argues, this purely ecological boundary just crystallized. It turned into an ethnic and political marker and finally into a divine mandate, which the Prophet Muhammad then inherited. The whole health rationale? The author states that was constructed entirely after the fact.
To further support this idea of historical inheritance, the source points to the undeniable structural overlaps between Islamic halal and Jewish kosher law, known as kashrut. The prohibited categories and the slaughter methodology mirror each other almost perfectly. The text even notes that Quranic verse 5:5 explicitly permits Muslims to eat meat slaughtered by Jews and Christians. The author's conclusion is pretty straightforward here. Halal is essentially a modified kashrut. It's an inherited Jewish architecture with just a few edits, like dropping the meat-dairy separation but adding the alcohol ban.
Now let's fast forward to today in our 5th and final section, the modern halal industry.
Are you ready for the financial punchline of the author's critique? $2.3 trillion. That is the massive, staggering current valuation of the global halal food market. The certification market, all on its own, is projected to reach over $20 billion by 2033. The author uses this huge number to set up a really sharp critique of the modern, highly lucrative certification apparatus that has sprung up out of nowhere to manage these ancient laws. The text provides strong evidence of what it flat-out calls certification chaos. The author points out totally incompatible standards across the industry. For instance, UK agencies hold completely opposing views on machine-slaughtered poultry, yet both of them happily issue halal certificates. Malaysia's regulatory body, JAKM, has frequently revoked recognition of prominent foreign certification groups. And perhaps the most surprising part, the source notes that roughly 90% of halal-certified meat in the UK actually comes from stunned animals. That means a massive portion of consumers are buying products that classical tradition would strictly classify as haram. The author concludes that the incentives here are clearly aligning with market access and certification fees, not theological rigor.
Which brings us to a powerful summary of the author's stance. Ultimately, the author concludes that modern food safety infrastructure, nutritional science, and veterinary oversight are just far more reliable guides for what belongs on our plates than a 7th century inheritance. Now, the author does acknowledge that these laws probably made perfect sense in their original context, right? They reduced risks before refrigeration existed and discouraged the domestication of animals that competed with humans for scarce water. But today's reality has transformed that risk calculus entirely. The problem, the source argues, isn't the dietary law itself, it's the guilt-inducing claim that it represents eternal, timeless science.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to chew on. Are our dietary traditions a reflection of eternal divine foresight, or simply a fascinating snapshot of ancient history? It's a question that perfectly synthesizes the core thesis of the text we've unpacked today. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.